I'd heard rumors for years, scholars murmuring in half-forgotten corners, speaking of a library said to be older than any known to man, a place where the darkest secrets of humanity were housed, a place said to be under the watchful eye of an ancient being, a librarian of sorts, who was known as the Poet. It was always a half-joke, the subject of drunken conversations and cryptic footnotes in the most forbidden texts. But the whispers that followed the library, well, they were enough to ignite a fire in me. I had dedicated my life to seeking out forbidden knowledge, to uncovering truths hidden in the dusty shadows of ancient tomes. My research had led me down countless dead ends, until one day, in the depths of a decaying manuscript, I found a clue. The description was cryptic, but it mentioned a library at the world's forgotten end, where knowledge came at a steep price. It wasn't much, but it was enough. My search took me far beyond the civilized world, to a place where the land grew desolate and barren. The ground beneath my feet cracked and flaked like dry parchment, and the air felt charged with something unseen, a weight I couldn't explain. The trees that dotted the landscape were gnarled, their bark peeling in strips like old, brittle skin. It was here, beneath a dark sky and a silent wind, that I found the entrance. A worn stone archway, partially consumed by the creeping vines. It led to a simple iron door. The moment I set eyes on it, I knew. This was the library. I reached for the handle, feeling an icy chill run up my arm as I touched the iron. For a moment I hesitated. I had chased this place for so long, yet now, on the threshold, something primal inside me screamed to turn back. But my curiosity, my hunger for knowledge, overwhelmed the fear. With a deep breath, I pulled open the door and stepped inside. The air was thick and stifling, as though it had not been disturbed for centuries. The dim light that filtered through the high windows cast long, flickering shadows on the walls, illuminating towering shelves that stretched further than my eyes could follow. Each one was filled with books of various shapes and sizes, their bindings dull in the faint light. The first thing that struck me was how old everything seemed. The books appeared ancient, their covers faded, the spines cracked. There was something else too, a strange scent, metallic and sickly sweet. It clung to the air. It was as though the library itself was alive, its presence pressing in around me, whispering promises of secrets long buried. I walked further, my footsteps muffled by the thick dust that coated the floor. The shelves seemed to curve in strange ways, creating a maze-like structure that made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. I ran my fingers across the spines of books as I passed, marveling at the feel of them. The leather was supple, almost soft, yet there was something unnerving about the texture. I couldn't quite place it. My curiosity soon got the better of me, and I plucked one of the smaller volumes from the shelf. Its cover was a pale tan, smooth but fine creases, like aged parchment. The title, The Life of Carrick, was embossed on the spine, in an ink that seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light. It felt strange in my hands, heavy, warm even. I opened the book, eager to discover what secrets it held. Carrick's story. Carrick had been a farmer, a simple man who lived a simple life. The first few pages recounted the dull routines of his existence, tilling the soil, tending his crops, raising a family in a small, weather-beaten cottage. The writing was stark, direct, yet there was a subtle beauty in the simplicity of his life. But as I read further, something darker began to unfold. Carrick's crops began to fail. His land, once fertile, became barren. His family grew hungry, and desperation set in. That was when he met a stranger, a mysterious figure who offered him a bargain. The man promised Carrick prosperity in exchange for something small, something that wouldn't be missed. Carrick, blinded by hunger and despair, agreed. But the bargain was not what it seemed. Carrick's fortunes did indeed improve, but only for a short while. His crops flourished, his family's bellies were filled, but as time passed, his body began to wither, his skin dried and cracked, and soon he was nothing more than a walking husk, barely alive. The stranger returned one final time, demanding his payment. The last few pages described in horrifying detail how Carrick was skinned alive. His essence, his very life, was trapped within the pages of the book I held. His skin had been used to bind the very volume I was reading. I dropped the book in horror, my stomach lurching. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The texture I had felt earlier, the strange softness, it wasn't leather. The books in this library were bound in human flesh. I stepped back, my mind racing, bile rising in my throat. I needed to leave. This place, it was far more dangerous than I had imagined. But as I turned to find my way out, the shelves shifted, closing in around me, twisting the path I had just walked. I stumbled through the maze of shelves, panic setting in as I realized there was no way out. The library was alive, responding to my fear, and it wasn't about to let me leave so easily. Desperate, I grabbed another book, hoping for some clue, something that would explain what was happening. The cover of this one was darker, the skin smoother, almost delicate. The title read, "The Life of Lady Elena." I hesitated, but opened it nonetheless. Lady Elena had been a noble woman, born into wealth and privilege. Her life at first seemed perfect. She had everything she could ever want: riches, beauty, influence. But her happiness was shattered when her only son fell gravely ill. No physician could cure him, and his condition worsened. Elena became desperate. In her desperation, she sought out forbidden magic. The book described her journey to a dark sorcerer who promised to save her son's life, but at a terrible cost. Elena was willing to give anything, and so she did. She gave her beauty, her wealth, her very soul to keep her son alive. For a time it worked. Her son recovered, but Elena's sacrifice had left her withered, hollow, a shell of her former self. As the years passed, her son grew resentful of the things she had become. He spurned her, rejected her love, and in the end, died anyway, leaving Elena with nothing. The book's final pages detailed her fate. Like Carrick, she was skinned alive, her flesh used to bind her own story. Her life, her suffering, all trapped in the pages I now held. A wave of nausea washed over me, but I forced it down. I couldn't lose my composure. Not now. I placed the book back on the shelf, my hands shaking. The library was playing with me, toying with my mind, but I refused to give in to despair. I had to keep moving. I pressed on, deeper into the maze, though every instinct screamed at me to turn back. The shelves twisted and stretched, warping my sense of direction. The further I went, the more the air seemed to thicken, growing oppressive and foul. I knew I was walking in circles, but each time I tried to retrace my steps, the path changed. And then I found the third book. This one was larger, its binding rough and uneven. The title read, "The Life of Ulrich," and beneath the name in faint, almost imperceptible letters was a single word: Hunter. The moment I opened the book, I knew this story would be different. Ulrich had been a hunter, but not of animals. He hunted men, a bounty hunter, ruthless and unrelenting. He had built a reputation on his ability to track down anyone, no matter how far they fled or how well they hid. He was known for his cruelty, for delivering his captives alive, barely, so they could face execution. The book described in vivid, brutal detail how he took pleasure in his work, how he reveled in the pain of his victims. But one day, Ulrich made a mistake. He hunted a man who was more than he appeared. The bounty was high, the challenge irresistible. When Ulrich finally caught him, the man laughed. He told Ulrich that he too was a hunter, and now it was Ulrich's turn to be hunted. The final pages described how Ulrich's prey skinned him alive, taking his essence and binding it into the book I now held. The man who had lived to cause others so much suffering had, in the end, become a victim of his own cruelty. I closed the book, feeling a growing dread. This library wasn't just a collection of stories. It was a prison for the souls of those whose lives it had consumed. And the more I read, the more I realized that it was going to consume me too. The air around me grew colder, and I felt a presence, something watching me from the shadows. My breath came in ragged gasps as I realized I wasn't alone. I could feel it. Him, drawing closer. And then, from the darkness between the shelves, he emerged. The figure that stood before me was tall and thin, cloaked in a robe that seemed to be woven from the same flesh as the books themselves. His face was obscured by a hood, but I could feel his eyes on me, watching, studying. There was no sound as he moved, yet the very air seemed to bend and twist around him, as though reality itself recoiled in his presence. This was the poet. He said nothing at first, simply raising one long skeletal hand and pointing at the books I had been reading. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized the horrifying truth. This library was more than a repository. It was a workshop, and I was its next project. "Why?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "Why are you doing this?" The poet's voice, when it came, was like the rustling of pages, dry and ancient. "Stories," he said softly. are the truest form of life. They are eternal. Flesh withers, bones turn to dust, but words last forever. He moved closer, his voice soft and rasping, like a chant. Each of these lives, he gestured to the books around us, was a story waiting to be told. But they were incomplete. My role is to give them the ending they deserve. I stumbled back, horror gripping at me. And my story? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. What about me? The poet turned slightly, his hooded head tilting as though considering my question. Your story, he said, is nearly finished. With a sudden motion, he extended his hand towards me, and from behind him the books I had read, Carrick's, Lady Elena's, and Ulrich's, rose from the shelves and hovered in the air. The covers peeled back, and their contents began to spill out before my eyes. The skinned, hollow forms, the forms of the people whose lives I had just relived. They stepped from the pages, their skinless bodies twisted, contorted in agony, their hollow sockets fixed on me. Panic surged through me, and I turned to run, but the library had shifted once more, the shelves closing in, trapping me with the skinless horrors. I could hear their rasping breaths, their fleshless limbs dragging across the floor as they moved toward me. Desperation seized me. My mind raced, grasping at the only chance I had. These creatures, Carrick, Lady Elena, Ulrich, were all bound to their stories, trapped in the fate the poet had woven for them. But I had read their stories. I knew how they had lived and how they had died. I backed away from Carrick, who was the closest, his skinless body barely held together by sinew and muscle, his hollow eyes glowing faintly, filled with the same despair that had consumed him in life. But I remembered the bargain he had made with the stranger, the deal that had cost him his skin. He had been desperate, willing to sacrifice anything to save his family. "Carrick," I shouted, my voice cracking. "Your family! They're still waiting for you, aren't they? The man, the one you made the deal with, he promised you prosperity. But what did he take from you?" The skinless figure hesitated, his twisted form shaking, as if the mention of his past stirred some deep, buried part of him. His eyes, though hollow, seemed to flicker with a dim, distant memory. "The stranger," I pressed. "He cheated you, didn't he? Took your life, your body, and for what? Your family is gone now. There's nothing left for you here." Carrick let out a low, mournful groan, his skeletal fingers trembling. For a moment I thought he might collapse, fall back into the story that had trapped him. But instead he turned away from me, his form fading into the shadows. One down. Lady Elena was next. Her gaunt, skinless frame moved slowly, as though weighed down by the memories of her lost son. Her once elegant hands were nothing more than bones wrapped in sinew, her face a mask of despair. "Elena," I called out, "your son, he never forgave you, did he? You gave everything for him, and in the end he hated you for it." She stopped, her head turning towards me, though she made no sound. "Everything you sacrificed, it was all for him. But he's gone now, and you? What are you? Just a hollow shell of what you used to be. A mother who lost everything." Elena's bony hands trembled, her body shaking violently. She let out a low, mournful wail before her form too dissolved into the air, leaving only the oppressive silence of the library behind. 2 down. But Ulrich was different. He hadn't lived for others. He had hunted, thrived on the suffering of those he captured. His life had been a dark reflection of his own cruelty, and now he loomed before me, his sinew-stretched, skinless frame standing tall, his eyes blazing with malice. There would be no reasoning with him. I backed away, my mind racing, searching for anything that could help me. But Ulrich was faster than I had expected. He lunged towards me, his bony hand slashing through the air. I barely dodged the attack, feeling the sting as his fingers grazed my skin. I scrambled backwards, heart pounding. Ulrich, do you think this is your legacy? Do you think you'll be remembered as the great hunter? You're nothing but a hollow story, forgotten and rotting on a shelf. Ulrich faltered, his hollow eyes fixed on me, uncertainty creeping into his posture. That's right. Your cruelty, your dominance, it's all meaningless now. Look at you. No skin, no power, no respect. You're just another nameless, pitiful figure trapped in this cursed library. Your story is forgotten. He paused, his body shaking, the confidence in his gait faltering. No one remembers you, Ulrich. The people you tormented, not your victims, and in the end, all your violence led to nothing. Your name has faded, your legend rots, and soon, no one will ever care who you were. The hunter of men recoiled, his hollow sockets narrowing as the words sank in. His form began to waver, as though his existence itself was unraveling. You're not even worthy of being written about, Ulrich. You're a failed hunter, a ghost with no future. Your story is finished. No one cares to read it. At last he let out a shriek of despair as his body started to disintegrate, his very essence dissolving into the air. His skinless form collapsed into dust, leaving behind nothing but an empty echo of what he once was. I collapsed against the shelf, panting, the silence of the library now heavier than ever. But I wasn't safe yet. The poet still stood in the shadows, watching. You think you can escape? His voice echoed around me, sending a shiver down my spine. You are already part of this library. Every page you've turned, every step you've taken, it's all been written. I forced myself to my feet. I'm not like the others, I said, though my voice wavered with uncertainty. I can finish my own story. The poet stepped forward, his skeletal hand reaching towards me. Your story is nearly complete, and now all that remains is for you to give the final piece. I turned and ran, not caring where I was going. The shelves twisted and shifted around me, but I kept running, my breath ragged, my heart racing. Behind me I could hear the poet's footsteps, slow but relentless. I burst through the maze of shelves and found myself at the entrance once more, the iron door just within reach. I grasped the handle and pulled with all my strength, flinging the door open. But as I stepped through, a searing pain shot through my arm. I cried out, looking down to see a long, jagged tear in my skin that had been peeled away, leaving the raw flesh beneath exposed. The poet's voice echoed in my mind, soft and cold. You may run, but part of you will always remain here. I staggered out into the open air, clutching my wounded arm. The library door slammed shut behind me, its cold iron sealing the horrors inside. But as I looked down at the wound, I realized the full weight of the poet's words. He had taken a part of me, my skin, and somewhere deep within that cursed library, my story had been written. I ran, not knowing how far I could go before I collapsed, wondering if what I would lost would be enough for the poet to bind my book. What would it mean if he had enough flesh for his binding? What would it mean if he didn't? I'm not sure. I'm not sure I want to know.